A former columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, Vanessa Hua has filed stories from China, Burma, South Korea, and elsewhere. She is the author of the best-selling novel A River of Stars and the award-winning story collection Deceit and Other Possibilities. Her many honors include a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship and a Steinbeck Fellowship in Creative Writing. Her most recent book, Forbidden City, is a bestseller. The Washington Post calls the book masterful, vital, eye-opening, and timely. This evening, she'll be joined in conversation with Pia Sarkar, Deputy Business Editor for Enterprise at the Associated Press, based in Philadelphia, and board member of the South Asian Journalists Association. Please welcome our guests to the Free Library.
Thank you to the Free Library for having us, and of course, Vanessa Hua for coming out from California and joining us here. So I thought we would just start with Vanessa reading from her book.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here tonight, and thanks so much to the Free Library. I love public libraries, and I'm so grateful to be here. So, I'm going to read from the opening chapter of Forbidden City, which is, and we'll get into it, but you may or may not know that Mao was a fan of ballroom dancing, and that he had a troupe of young women that he partnered with in the ballroom and in the bedroom. So the chapter I'll be reading from, May, the protagonist, has been selected at this point, for a mysterious, all she knows it's a mysterious duty in the capital. Forbidden City. At dawn, Ma filled our wooden tub with hot water. She hadn't bathed me in years and wouldn't have done so again until my wedding day. A few meters away, my sisters slumbered. Later, I'd wonder if they might have been pretending, their parting gift to offer me the privacy I never had there. Ma squatted behind me and poured ladles of water over my head, the scent of dust and sweat rising off in the steam. The drops trickled down my nape, my shoulders, my chest, every part of me cherished. I leaned into her hands. Her breathing became ragged, and I felt her trembling through my body until we were both shaking. "Little May," she murmured. When I tried to turn around, she gripped my shoulders. The water in the tub had gone lukewarm, and I shivered, the hairs raised on the back of my neck and arms. "Ma?" I asked. She didn't answer. She dried me in circling strokes, her hands slowed as if to delay our parting. It was the tenderness I'd always craved from her. Though she must have heard the fear in my voice, she couldn't face me. Not then, maybe not ever again. She would no longer warn me about fox fairies, shapeshifters who roam the twilight to lure travelers, of disappeared girls, run away or raped, kidnapped or killed. She knew that she had no choice but to give me up, I can now see, and didn't want me thinking about the dangers ahead. In that moment, though, I hardened against her, against my fear and my anger. She couldn't help me, and I didn't need her. The picture of the chairman on the wall seemed to nod in the flickering light. He alone would protect me on this journey. Ma helped me step into pants and a tunic that she had patched and pounded clean in the river. She braided my hair into a coil. I gave in to the gentle tugging, in to the mesmerizing firelight, hoping that I would be transformed like the braid, intricate and beautiful and strong as a model revolutionary. Shifting my eyes, I tried to hold still to keep from disturbing my mother's work. It was an hour spent on me alone for what seemed like the first time in my life. Gazing into my mother's wrinkled face, I realized that she'd once been my age, leaving her family to marry a man she had never met. She didn't know she would endure beatings from her husband, endure the curse of daughters, the death of sons, and swallow suffering as often as air. If she had known, would she have left her village? That was how we survived, by not knowing what was ahead. She pressed a wooden cup into my hands, a murky brew that gave off the smell of boiled pond scum. Sipping it, I winced, my tongue curling back on itself. She pushed it towards me again, and I half gagged. "What's this?" I asked. Instead of answering, she handed me a pouch filled with tiny lumps, the color of bone, their stench even more intense than what she'd brewed. The earthy scent reminded me of dong quai, the golden flowers and sturdy roots we gathered every autumn. A desperate neighbor had come asking for it after she'd given birth twice within a year. had helped to keep a baby from taking hold. After I started my women's flow, Ba warned me against walking by myself at dusk, telling me to bolt from men who got too close. Why, he never said, but I understood. The curves that made me clumsy and set my running off kilter also invited the attentions of men who could ruin me. Drink this every morning, Ma now said. I finished the brew and set down the bowl. Every morning, I repeated, then swirled my tongue against my teeth to get rid of the sour, bitter taste. The party's jeep arrived with a groan and a rattle. As the hen squawked, Ba climbed off the bed, ladled me a bowl of porridge, and dropped in thick slices of salted turnips. I ate while standing, holding the bowl close to my face. He did too. My father's fingers were the finest part of him, nimble, whether mending a basket or plucking a radish. As a teenager, he'd left for the provincial capital to make his fortune. Although he'd wanted to work in a textile factory, he returned a year later, missing his little finger, a failure that still defined him and our family in the village. I was used to the stump, but his long fingers curved around his bowl now seemed lonely, his hand missing its smallest part. He turned away and coughed, wiping at his mouth. My family never said anything about his cough, yet another ailment among us that lingered and festered, like the sores that never quite healed, the scratch that persisted, the irritation in our eyes that went on for so long we forgot we'd lived any other way. I stared at his hand, the smear of blood undeniable, yet when I looked up, he wordlessly ordered me to ignore it. I set down the bowl, unable to finish more than a few bites. Difficult as this life was, it was all I had known. When Ma brushed down stray hairs at the crown of my head, my resolve disappeared and the urge to cling to my parents overwhelmed me. Ba lifted my elbow to lead me to the door. Gentle, not rough, this gesture gave me the strength to leave.
So Vanessa, I just wanted to ask you, what was the inspiration for this book? I know you had taken a long time to write it, and I just wanted to find out, how did you even get started? What inspired you?
So about a decade and a half ago, I came across a photo of Mao surrounded by giggling young girls in plaid with Peter Pan collars. They looked like bobby soxers, and I was completely fascinated. How were they clustered so closely around him? What was the story? And as I mentioned, I found out that he was this fan of ballroom dancing, and that in fact there was an American journalist, Agnes Smedley, who traveled to the rebel stronghold in 1937. And among the amusements that she passed the time with, besides rat catching and gardening, was teaching the top party leaders how to square dance and foxtrot. And in the decades that followed, he had these special cultural work troops of young women he partnered with. And when I tried to find out more information, there wasn't much. Mao's physician wrote a memoir in which he said, oh, for these young women, it was the most exhilarating experience they would ever know, the highest honor of their life. And I thought, probably more complicated than that. And because, I feel like fiction can really flourish where the official record ends. And with this novel, I really wanted to get inside the head of a young woman who, at a time when so many party leaders were falling by the wayside, getting purged, was able to be at his side, was able to advise him, was able, even though young women everywhere in the world are often sort of dismissed as silly and their concerns unimportant, what does it take for someone who's been raised to believe this man is a god and yet survive with him during the most tumultuous time in modern Chinese history?
And can you talk a little bit about, starting this book 10 years ago, right?
This book took me 14 years to write,
okay.
About a third of my life. I started it the summer before I went off to get my Master's of Fine Arts, and that was in 2007. And at the time, I was working on another novel, but I was so fascinated by this photo I saw that I wrote a short story that was set only at one of these dance parties, because I think the idea of writing a novel about it just seemed too frightening, right? And but I wrote the short story, but then I was like, I am tugged by how she ended up there that night, what happened afterwards, where she might have, and I was a longtime reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, and I would write about, I loved going to Chinatown because you just never knew that woman who looks like a granny who's elbowing you out of the way. She could have been a Red Guard. She could have been Mao's lover. And I wanted really to be able to trace, who this young woman was and her journey from, from idealism to disillusionment.
Can you talk a little bit about how the story evolved from what you had in your mind when you were kind of conceiving of it, and how it changed over time?
Well, what's interesting is I didn't necessarily intend for the book to take 14 years to write. And if anyone in the audience is a writer and working on a long project, keep the faith. You never know what journey we'll have to take. And I think what's so interesting about historic fiction is that not only is it about a very specific time and place, and that I, the writer or the reader, will also have a chance to learn about, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on our own times. And that is to say, in the 14 years it took to write the book, I had huge personal shifts in my life. I gave birth to my twin sons, who are now 11. My father passed away. And then also the world changed. We saw the rise of demagoguery. We saw the rise of the Me Too movement. We saw the isolation that came from the pandemic. And none of that, of course, would enter the world of the characters in my novel. That would be all anachronistic. But it certainly shaped my thinking about dynamics. And I also know it's in the minds of the readers, right? And that, so take, for example, something like over time, my thinking about relationships between younger men or younger women and older men, how to frame it, it's sort of the repercussions, all of that was shaped by sort of the society I lived in as I was writing the book.
I don't know if you ever go back and reread any of the passages, or do you ever go back and look back at your writing, or think about, like, I would have done something differently, or how do you reflect on your own writing?
Well, I have definitely never read it from start to finish again since I finished writing it, or since I put the last copy edits to it. But I will say this. So there's a copy of the original version of this book at UC Riverside, which is where I got my MFA, and it's shelved, and so every time I go back on campus to speak, I go visit it. It kind of feels like I want to see an old friend. Actually, someone told me you're always supposed to leave like a dollar bill in your thesis to see if anyone actually checked it out and read it. But someone's like, you should be putting 20s in now, not $1 bills. So it definitely felt like I was visiting not a ghost, but an old friend. And actually, there are some lines that are still there. Well, in terms of thinking, are there things that I wish I did differently? There's so many different permutations of their book. I probably, in the multiverse, it's like there's, I don't know, infinity versions of the book that I've worked on or considered. Just one example, in one version of the book, so this book right now is prologue is in 1976 San Francisco Chinatown, and the rest is during the Cultural Revolution in China. But in the sort of, I don't know, first third of its existence, it was maybe about 30% Chinatown. And there was this whole plot with gang warfare. It was very exciting, but it was just too much. So
you talked about the official record and filling in the gaps of the official record, but what did the official record tell you? Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research that went into the book?
So I read anything from historical accounts of those times to also there's a lot of memoirs written by people who suffered in the Cultural Revolution. It's a whole genre known as scar literature because of just the horrors of those times. But it's funny, stuff that didn't end up in the book necessarily. I think my editor really showed me that you can't get too much into the weeds, that that stuff is already covered in the thick tomes that I consulted, and people can turn and refer to that. My goal was, again, whose story did I want to center? Instead of this young woman that is just not in any historical record, or not much. And you just sort of kind of glimpse, like in the photo or in the sort of in the shadows, and try to understand it. Or even in the history books, I'd be like, oh, I'd be reading the scene and be like, oh, so the couch was velvet. Like those were the details that I was sort of interested in trying to convey. Or it was, for example, his villas. He had villas all over the country, and they were musty because they'd be shut up for months at a time, but had to be ready at a moment's notice. So just kind of thinking about the physicality was really interesting to me. And in fact, part of being able to get into Mao's character, or the chairman, as he's called in the novel, or in May's head and mind and body, was through the body. When I was a freshman at Stanford, ballroom dancing was one of the most popular classes on campus. It still is, apparently. I checked with someone who's still an undergrad there. And so being able to understand what it's like to, having that excitement as the opening bars of music, like what it feels like to have beats coming up through a wooden floor or people dancing in unison, I was able to sort of apply that to the character, who is otherwise like very 2D, hugely iconic, but how do you sort of flesh them out? And in the same way, Mao was this huge swimmer. He would take political meetings at the pool. He swam in the Yangtze River to kind of prove to everyone that he was still fit and vigorous, an athletic autocrat, as you will. And I love swimming as well. And so that's something that I could bring to it. The visceral is really how you can get at aspects of a character. Like, sure, there's plenty that might have appeared in the record, but there's going to be still so much more that has to be achieved at through imagination and through empathy.
Has anyone from the dance troupe ever told their story? Have they ever shared it in any way, or how did you? I know that a lot of it is obviously fiction, but I wondered if you were able to ever get inside their minds through anything that they've written.
There was an interview. When you work on a book for 14 years, sometimes more things come out than were available at the beginning. And so, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, I found some article in Chinese that I then translated into English, and it was of one of these young women, and I had sort of guessed at the catty dynamics in the dance troupe, and there she was in her description talking about it. And it wasn't like I was a mind reader, but it's just, again, there's so much that we as fiction writers, we attempt to go at by trying to imagine from what we know into the mind of another. So. And
it was kind of interesting to see sort of that cattiness between like young girls, and some of it would resonate in like even current times, just that mean girl thing just still happens today.
Women being pitted against each other.
Right, exactly. And so you grew up in California, you were born and raised in California. Can you talk a little, I know that you went back to China even before you were doing research for this book, but I think what I really marveled about this book was just your ability to put us in place. Like, it was such descriptive writing. Like, I really felt like I was there. How were you able to get that sense of place? Was it just from like your memory of traveling there yourself, or how were you able to recreate all those scenes?
Well, I first traveled to China in 2004 as a reporter for the Chronicle, and I was writing about the rise of modern China, and I remember hanging out with these young women from the countryside who'd ridden trains for 3 days, and we ended up at this, and they worked in factories, and life was very hard, the hours long. But then we were playing this dice game that I never figured out the rules to, and drinking beer, and it was fun, and I just sort of marveled, and not to overly romanticize it, but they just had a life very different from the one that had been handed down to them. And given that my own parents are immigrants, there's something, all my life I've wondered what it means to leave everything behind in the hopes of something bigger or different. So that informed my thinking. And then the factory girls I met in 2004 certainly it's not the same era, but again, there's something through time about those who leave versus those who stay. And in 2008, I returned to research, and I went into villages, interviewing people grannies who lived through that era, and then I sort of I trace some of the path that my protagonist takes through the country and some of the also the political sites that are depicted in the book. But there was this moment where I was standing in Hong Kong, looking back towards China, and it was a scene I'd already written, that she takes this swim to Hong Kong, and it was the eeriest feeling because I had done all this research, and then I had written the scene, but I kind of almost went to that spot to confirm things, and it was as I had imagined. And again, it wasn't as if I had somehow, it felt eerie, like, did I conjure this into being? Of course I didn't, but I think it speaks to the power of imagination and what you can get at sort of like stretching your vision wholly towards your character.
Should we hear another excerpt from the book?
Oh, sure. And, you know, I think something that I've always thought is just the past is never as distant as it seems, and you'll see why with this passage. This takes place the night that the first night she spends with the chairman. And she's in his bedchambers. The chairman propped himself up on his elbow. Some things you look at for so often, you miss them. You're opening our eyes to things we've stopped seeing. He rubbed my thigh, smiling with a bubble of pleasure I would come to recognize as a side effect of the pills that put him to sleep. Within moments of turning off the lights, he was snoring, sprawled on his back, his arms and legs splayed, a man no longer accustomed to sharing his bed. Wondering if I could fall asleep beside him, I edged toward the wall as far as I could go, up against stacks of books. When I undid my hair, my scalp throbbed in relief. Licking my cracked lips, I tasted blood, salty and sacrificial. I'd been spared from getting pregnant tonight, but I'd run out of my mother's tea and I'd have to find more. Dong Quai grew in the hills above the village and the moldering damp beneath the forest canopy. The gardens at the lake palaces were vast, though, and such treatments might have been passed down from dynasty to dynasty. An imperial doctor could have secretly cultivated it for the empress and other court ladies, and maybe it still grew here, the gardeners tending it as they would any other ornamental flower. Women had other ways to keep a baby from taking hold. In the dance troupe, Busy Shan once explained that you were most likely to get pregnant a couple weeks after your monthly flow. Think of when sows are bred, she said, how long after they go into heat. If you washed yourself with vinegar afterward, rinsing as far up as you could go, you could protect yourself too. You have to wash immediately after, she said. We'd been whispering after lights out in the dorm. Can't teacher Fan help, I asked. You say one word to her and you're gone, Busy Shan said. To avoid getting sent away, the girls tried to take care of it on their own. Is there anything else? Dolly Yu asked shyly. You could offer him a dish of tofu, Busy Shan said. Some men love to eat tofu. They want nothing else. Her talk set off shocked giggles. I hadn't understood the joke then, but now all at once I did. Tofu, soft and wet as a woman. What the chairman had done to me tonight, I might persuade him to again, and I could do the same to him, which disgusted me so much I could hardly stand to think it, but such an act would keep me from getting pregnant. None of us asked how Busy Shan possessed such knowledge, the sort of wisdom we taught one another, girl to girl, without the help of our mothers, who didn't want us contemplating such matters. When they were our age, they might have whispered about such secrets, swallow a jar of tea steeped for 2 days, choke down a mouthful of cold ash, jump from a tree, jump 1,000 times a day for a week. We didn't expect any man to concern himself with how to prevent pregnancy or how to end one. Although I'd never slipped into the fields or down by the river, others in my village must have. The newlywed bride who gave birth not so many months after she married, or the sprite of a classmate sent to live with an ailing aunt. When she returned, people said they could smell the milk on her, the milk meant for the baby she'd given up to another family. In her time away, her waist had thickened, her legs turned stocky and veined, and her high, sweet voice had coarsened. Her parents matched her up with a sickly old man. The widow haunted me most. She hid her pregnancy until she collapsed in the fields and gave birth to a baby boy, raw and red as a skinned rabbit. He died a day later. How broken she was afterward, her arms and legs shambling, her hair matted, a worn-out shoe, a whore. She might have been raped and raped again, every man a suspect. She'd been someone's mistress, every wife maid vulnerable. She had wronged us all, and in return, we despised her. She had to empty the latrines and tote water to the hilliest fields, stuck with the worst chores, until one day she disappeared. Wind rustled in the trees, their branches tapping against the windows. The chairman shifted, kicking me in the calf. I held still, and he didn't wake up. Back home, my family would curl together on our brick bed. In the dormitory, Midnight Chang would turn her wrath on another girl, doing to her what she couldn't to me. I alone had the chairman tonight.
Vanessa, can you talk a little bit about how much of your own family's history you tapped in pulling together this story, telling this story, and then what your family's reaction was to your book?
Sure. And maybe I'll even start with my family's reaction. That will kind of explain everything that came from there. So my parents were born in the 30s. They were always on the move in their childhood. They made their way to Taiwan, 1948. And I had thought that meant they had avoided the Cultural Revolution in a way. Or I'd heard that I had an aunt who was a bit of a mail order bride, and she was much more beautiful than my the levels of attraction are off compared to my uncle, let's say. And in fact, one uncle cruelly said, like, oh, it's like a flower planted in dung. That's a saying in Chinese. And it turned out, and it came out that, like, oh, she had suffered in the Cultural Revolution. Her family had been, thrown out of where they lived, and that, like, by the time my uncle came around, he was a great possibility for her. But I didn't know that I had any blood relatives that were impacted. And it wasn't until this book was published, last November, in fact, where I knew we'd had some, my brother had some half-siblings that had reached adulthood by the time the war came around, and had stayed behind in Shanghai. And it turned out, in fact, that they had suffered, that, like, they'd been denied going to school and someone had been sent to a work camp, but it was just nothing my father had ever discussed, and it had to take decades of silence before I could access that story. So when the galley, this is actually a galley version of the book, when it came out last Christmas, we all had dinner, and my mom said, okay, well, how about after dinner we help Vanessa give her suggestions for improving the book? But by the time something's in galley form, it's done. I said, Mom, the book is done. She's like, really? Not even the cover? And I love this cover because I think, actually, you may have noticed in a lot of historical fiction, the woman's looking away, or she's headless, or it's just her back, and I just love her direct gaze. I love this cover, the aesthetic, but it was in that moment that I realized, like, the iconography had a different resonance for her. For as this was representative of the forces that had torn apart her country, had forced her to, flee to Taiwan, and then later on come to the U.S. So it just had a different resonance. But since then, my mom's been, like, really proud of it, and comes to all my readings when they're local. But it is, I've talked to other people. There's a wonderful bookstore in New York called You and Me Books, and the owner, Lucy, said that her parents also lived through the Cultural Revolution, and she read the book, and it became a way to sort of help her understand what that era is, and also, to possibly open up conversations. And I think that's something that you always hope as a writer, that that this book, once it enters the world, can create spaces for those conversations.
Were your parents, you said they were a little bit reluctant to talk about it. Why do you think that was? Did they not think that their story or their history was it too painful for them to tell, or they didn't think of it as being told in the way that you wanted to tell it?
I think a lot of immigrants feel like it's maybe better to focus on the future, focus on the kids. Why talk about those times? Although, again, it's through more time passed, and then as adults, you start asking those questions, and more of it came out. But I just, they came to this country with what just could fit in their suitcase to go to grad school. So it's not, there's not much material they could have sort of, like, pointed to, like, this is the heirloom. But I did talk to someone who is a recent. She's a Chinese immigrant, and she has older siblings who lived through the Cultural Revolution. And I said, do they ever talk to their children about what happened? And she said, no. And I said, is it because it's too painful to talk about? And she said, no, because they don't want the children to talk about it at schools, because then the school would know that they were talking about it at home. So there is still fear around talking about it, I think. And in fact, when I was doing those interviews in the villages, we kind of drew a little bit of a crowd, visitors. And my husband, who's Caucasian, he said in Chinese, like, "wo bu dong," which means I don't know. And they were like all excited, like, he speaks Chinese. He just said, I don't know. But anyway, like there was this one woman who was like super chatty, but the moment I asked about that time, she's like, oh, I never learned how to read. I'm too stupid. Don't talk to me about it. So there is some fear around it still. Because, it's complicated because Mao represented China and the party, and so to go to speak of his mistakes would be to question the country itself.
So do you know how this book has first of all, I don't know how available it is in China, but how available is it as far as you can tell, and then how is it received from what you've been able to tell?
So there's no official Chinese version of it, but my first book, A River of Stars, which deals with one-child policy and maternity tourism centers, it also doesn't have an official edition in China, but I've twice been contacted by English majors in China who want to translate it as their thesis. So, which is a long way of saying there's no official version of this book in China. I don't necessarily know what the reception is, but I do have a feeling that no matter what sort of artificial walls get put down, like, information does have a way of finding its way through. So,
can you talk a little bit about what about this story you were able to, like, from current times, you were able to sort of relate back to this? Like, how from what you were doing research on, how much of that do you think is true today, even now?
It's hard to say. I haven't been to. When I won the NEA, I had planned to go in 2020, but then, a little something happened called the pandemic. But just even for news accounts, it's really interesting. Gen Zers who were born after Mao and after the Cultural Revolution now kind of idealize him. Some portion of it. China's a huge place. You can't say everyone believes this or that, but they see the vast income inequality that has only grown in the decades since its passing, and so they see like strength and merit to what he has written. And in fact, Xi Jinping has the tightest grip, his historic third term, and he very much is fashioning himself in the style of Mao, to the point where I read this official news article talking about what a great swimmer he was.
Yeah.
Like that, when he was during the Cultural Revolution, he swam from this island, though he knew he could do it and it wasn't too dangerous. but definitely, you're like, what's the deal? But it only makes sense if you understand that Mao set off this whole swimming craze in the country, and is still revered in that way. And I don't know, it'd be like if Biden. It's like, look at the way I crossed that Delaware. Like, we were actually there earlier with my family at the Washington's crossing. Right. It's not as wide as I thought it would be, but I know it was an icy cold night. But so it's just interesting in the ways it still reverberates. But it's not just like, I want to emphasize that, like, history and our founding myths are very difficult no matter what country you're from. Like, even in this country, we kind of see people reacting, backlashes, just in all the ways that we try to frame history.
And the main character really wants to believe in the lie, and I think that kind of speaks to even just human behavior, right? If you really want to believe in it, you'll see it, in whoever it is that you're trying to project it on. Well, I really want to thank you very much, Vanessa, for this wonderful talk, and I wanted to open it into the Free Library for having us, and let's open it up to questions. Any questions from the audience?
I wonder, since this book was published, do you think you would have any problem to go to China because you revealed, like, unpleasant details about chairman? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, and actually, there's an interesting thing in the book where it says like something. I think there's some like caveat. All incidents in dialogue, all characters, with the exception of some well-known historical figures, are products of the author's imagination and are not construed to be real. So I don't know if, like, at the visa office, if I'm like pointing to that, they would let me get in. But I don't know. I don't have any idea if that would be the case. I think travel to China anyway right now is quite difficult. There's limited flights, even if it's reopened and some of the COVID restrictions have been dropped. But I guess I'll have to see. Yeah.
If you accept one of those young Chinese English majors' offer to translate your book, what's the financing of that? Do you get a royalty from it? Then does your publisher then print the Chinese edition, or is there a Chinese agency that you deal with to do that? And do they want that?
Right. So it's actually interesting. For those inquiries I received, it was it's an academic. It's to get it so they can graduate. And in fact, they have to make sure it has never been translated in an official edition, because otherwise, their thesis is like them just like copying the official edition. But the way foreign rights work is there are agents who sort of represent different territories, and then will take the book and offer it up for rights. In the same way, like my first book, A River of Stars, was optioned by a screenwriter. So there are all these sort of different versions that can be resold, and my agent would work with a co-agent who represents these different areas of interest.
It's, I guess, in a way, such a privilege for you to be able to take your experience and talk about the Cultural Revolution and make art out of it. And it strikes me that that so many people in China can't use their own history, personal, national, in every way. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, about what kind of what's missing or what's under the surface when you talk to people about it, and what art might be made out of it in a kind of hypothetical future,
Well, I always just go back to thinking about how vast China is, and that, the novel itself is about the ways in which people find agency, even in the most oppressive of situations and regimes. And I have no doubt that, there's the concern that people might have about talking about such things at school, but like the art that they are making, or even just the puns that Chinese people will use to get around censors, right? Like using like some different combination of characters, and everyone knows what they're talking about, but they can elude the censors. I think there can be creativity and art made, and that people that there's always this drive for that, even when there's moments of like trying to figure out how their way around the restrictions.
So, what do you think became of your character May? Had you thought about that, like she was, you had the sort of ending coda in San Francisco in the 70s, I guess it was. Yeah. What do you think happened to her? Had you thought that through? Where is she now?
So I think she'd be in her 70s now, because I think I'm often asked with my two novels, like, oh, do you have a sequel planned, or where are they? And I wish her well. Isn't that what Gwyneth Paltrow said during the tribal to the chiropractor? I wish you well. But, I imagine her living out in the avenues in San Francisco, married to maybe the person that she was talking to in the epilogue. But I don't want to sugarcoat it and say that she lived the American dream, right? I think that's a founding myth and fantasy of our own country, that it's whatever life path she took, it was a hard one, right? But I wish her well.
Simple question: did you take dance lessons?
Yes.
If so, what?
Oh. In college, I for a couple years Richard Powers taught on campus. He still teaches there, actually. And he had this vintage dance troupe, and there was this thing called the Viennese Ball. And so, I learned, I learned tango, foxtrot, swing. I, love dancing. Even pianos. I did dance at a Roomba at my wedding, and then when we were on our honeymoon, we kept doing the dance like. I know, it's so dorky. So I loved it, but I don't really bust it out now, except for at weddings, but that sort of thing. But yeah, I love that feeling of leaning into it and being a body in motion and fling through space and letting the music sort of pour through you. So yeah.
It's interesting because there's like that intimacy there, but then there's also this like distance.
Formality.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly.
There's a pattern of steps.
Yep.
Yeah.
So any interest in having it become a movie? Like Shall We Dance?
Right.
The Japanese version, there'd be the Chinese version of...
So that's a complicated question. I think given, I have heard that it would be difficult to be made in the movie because you may or may not know there's a lot of Chinese financing of movies these days. There was that movie Megalodon about a giant shark. And I don't know if you saw it, but there was like a character with there was like a Chinese minor subplot where that character really didn't need to be in the movie. Like she had to like save her dad's life or something. And that was because of the Chinese financing. So in that same way, if they felt like, oh, this movie paints Mao in unflattering light, then it couldn't necessarily get made, or it couldn't be shown in Chinese markets. There have been movies made about Mao, but they're in China, but they're very hagiographic, and he's a saint.
Of course.
Yeah.
So I think we are wrapping up for the evening. I want to thank everyone again for coming out tonight. Thank you to the Free Library and, of course, to Vanessa.
Thank you all.